From Maine to New Mexico, Arkansas to Oregon, Civic Network Television is lighting up America. CNT, linking America's communities to each other and the future. Live from Washington, D.C., Civic Network Television brings you Mobilizing Community Assets. And now, our moderator, Ramona Evelyn.
Welcome to Civic Network Television's first course in the 1995 Building Community Curriculum. Tonight, we begin Mobilizing Community Assets, taught by Professors Jody Kretzmann and John McKnight. Many of you are familiar with their book, Building Communities from the Inside Out, and the innovative strategies they have developed. Those strategies and their reputations as outstanding community organizers and teachers have made them much in demand. But now it's time to begin Program 1, Changing the Way We Think About Communities. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our faculty, Professors Jody Kretzmann and John McKnight. Both are associated with the Center for Urban Affairs and Policy Research at Northwestern University, where Jody is director of the Neighborhood Innovations Network and John is director of Community Studies. Joining us in the studio and participating in the training are business, neighborhood, and civic leaders representing a cross-section of citizens from Washington, D.C. And now, let's turn to our distinguished faculty to begin Module 1, From Needs to Assets. John and Jody, please tell us a little more about the experience you bring to this work.
Ramona, thank you very much. I know that Jody and I are both very excited about this opportunity to share the work we've done. Although it isn't really the work we've done, what we've done is collected information about how local communities solve problems. And we've done that from the Center for Urban Affairs at Northwestern University for a good many years now. We think we've been doing something that most universities don't do, and that is we have been trying to understand how local citizens solve problems. You know, a lot of universities study the problems they think communities create. But when it comes down to it, the fact of the matter is that communities are the great problem solvers of this society. And it isn't here in Washington that the great problem solutions are. It is among citizens in communities. And we have learned for 25 years at the Center for Urban Affairs how local citizens do that kind of work. Now, Jody and I both have feet in two camps. We both have spent a lot of our lives as community organizers. I started out as a neighborhood organizer in Chicago and did a lot of work with civil rights organizations in the 60s. And from the university now, we've been able to continue our contact with the leaders of local communities and keep track of those initiatives, to learn from them and hopefully to relate to them. Jody, I know you have a foot in both camps as I have.
I think that's right, John. I think probably the most important thing for people to know about us as we start this discussion that we're going to be having tonight and then 2 nights coming up is that really probably our hearts are still in communities on the west and south side of Chicago, a little bit more than they are in universities. I mean, I think when we think about who our best teachers have been, we're more likely to begin naming people in neighborhoods across the United States who have taught us. And so we have both done organizing. We've both thought a lot about and done a lot in the community development world. And we thought a little bit about the policies at the city level and state and federal level, and from the point of view of funders and other kinds of helpers that might, in fact, help communities build from the inside out. So that's what we bring. We bring this foot in both camps, and we're trying to think with our colleagues in communities across the United States about what it is that it takes as we go into the 21st century to build strong and healthy communities. Now let me say a word about the work which underlines our immediate set of discussions, so you know what it is that we're coming before you to sort of report, because that's really what we are tonight. We're reporters for you all and for folks that we hope will join in our discussion across the country. We're reporters from a kind of odyssey that we've been on for the last now 5 years or so. We got a little bit of money, John and I and a few colleagues at the Center for Urban Affairs, to take off across the country and to spend time in communities across the country, mostly in cities, but in some smaller communities and rural areas as well. And the communities we were looking at were usually the most devastated, the most challenged communities in those cities. So we've spent a lot of time in places like the South Bronx, places like Roxbury in Boston, south and west side of Chicago, east side of Detroit, south central Los Angeles. And we've built a lot of relationships with community folks in those neighborhoods. But what we're after in those communities, though, is something that I think academics go after all too rarely. We ask people to tell stories, to tell their own stories, but to tell a particular kind of story. We were after stories about what works. What is it that in the face of real challenges, what succeeds? And we defined success fairly loosely. We said, tell us the stories that make you think that you could have a successful son or daughter or a successful grandchild, and you could imagine that grandchild living here in this neighborhood, the South Bronx or South Central Los Angeles. So we were after stories that didn't mean success means we leave. All right? We were after stories that said success, yes, but it means we can stay and we can imagine a future for this neighborhood. And we've collected hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those success stories from across the United States. And it's that treasure trove, if you will, of successful community building efforts that we've been learning from and where we've been trying to get into discussions with our now friends and colleagues across the United States. And that's what we want to report out to you in the next little while. When I think about those stories and what an incredible privilege it's been to collect them, I think too about what a wonderful moment this is for us to be thinking about these stories, right? Because this is a moment when government is reinventing itself. Government is in all kinds of trouble. We know that. We know that the discussion here in Washington, where we sit tonight, is about a kind of reconception of what a public sector is about. We know, too, that the whole economy, global as well as national and regional and local, is different than it was 20 years ago. And that these adjustments that people are going through all over the United States are absolutely fundamental. One of the things it's doing is, at this very moment, it's making people all over the United States say, let's take another look at our communities. What do we have here to build on? How can we recreate economy and polity so that in the 21st century, we've got a platform to stand on and allow us to adjust? So that's the reality that our success stories speak to, and that's what we want to point to as we go through these next three discussions with you all. When I think about the success stories that we found, a number of them come to mind. But I suppose somewhere near the top of my list, and I want to just tell you a couple to kick us off here. Somewhere near the top of my list is a group of friends in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, in the Dudley Street area of the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, where, in the only case we know about at this point, a whole transfer of civic authority, of government authority, has happened with this local neighborhood group. It's a group called the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, and here's just the beginning of their story.
Now in its 8th year, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative was this community's response to decades of disinvestment and government neglect. It is only 1.5 miles from the office towers of downtown Boston, but half the land in this area of Roxbury and Dorchester, Massachusetts, lies vacant, more than 300 lots. Over 40% of the families live below the poverty level. Once a thriving neighborhood, white flight to the suburbs in the 1950s and 60s led to disinvestment and arson. With the support of the Riley Foundation, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative formed as a community-controlled group representing residents, agencies, businesses, and religious organizations. Their mission is nothing less than the rebuilding of the entire community, from affordable housing to community services to the creation of jobs. One of the first campaigns was to clean up the neighborhood and close down the trash transfer stations.
Of all the communities in Massachusetts, they take this community to do their illegal dumping. Why do they do that?
The community prevailed and the transfer stations were locked. Over the next 2 years, DSNI completed a comprehensive development plan, which would fill the vacant land with affordable housing, community centers, retail space, and playgrounds. The plan was later adopted by the City of Boston as its official development plan.
Today we come together to celebrate a very unique plan that stresses services to rebuild the spirit of this community as well as to develop the neighborhood.
DSNI went on to make history as the first grassroots group in the country to win the power of eminent domain over all vacant land in the neighborhood. The community will use this power to become the nation's first inner-city neighborhood to implement its own development plan.
So there you have one story which we find immensely rich in terms of the lessons it has to teach. Ordinary people saying, everybody in Boston has a plan for our neighborhood but us. We'll make our own plan, and it'll be so professional and so widely owned that we'll take it to the city, and the city will grant us then the power that we need to make that plan real. It's a real story, it seems to me, of a community victory. Another story that we've learned an awful lot from is a story that's a little closer to home for John and me. It's a story that comes off the west side of Chicago, where we've spent an awful lot of time in our years in Chicago. The community is called West Garfield Park. And there, about 15 years ago, a little church with 40 people in it sort of faced a do-or-die decision. Do we pick up and leave and give up in this church, or do we stay? And if we stay, how can we stay and be effective? Was it what these 40 folks were saying to each other at that point? Well, they prayed about it, and they thought about it, and they made the decision to stay. And what we have now is the story that has unfolded when those folks said, we're going to be serious. And when they started looking around and saying, well, what do we have to build on? And when they found, well, it's just us in a mortgage-free church building, the first thing they did was remortgage the church building, buy one of those old, abandoned, roach-infested 3 flats down the street, and then troop down after church every Sunday to rebuild that thing by themselves. And after 6 months, they had a spanking new apartment building. They turned it over, and with the proceeds, they bought another one. Now it's 15 years later, and what we're dealing with at Bethel New Life is a $10 million a year community development corporation, a group that in fact now employs 500 people in the community, right, providing jobs for folks, a group that has built or rehabilitated over 1,000 units of affordable housing for people in that neighborhood, so that you've got a kind of beacon of hope out there now. I want to now introduce you to the vice president of the board at Bethel New Life, Sheila Radford Hill, who can tell a little bit more about that story herself from her own point of view. Here's Sheila.
The West Garfield Austin community is a community, even at that time, that was under great stress, and I wasn't sure what I could do and how I could fit in. And that's when I changed my membership to Bethel Lutheran Church and got involved in Bethel New Life as a ministry, as a commitment to doing something about the problems in the neighborhood that I live in. I've seen abandonment and blight. I've seen the flight of manufacturing and jobs. And I've seen it pretty much firsthand because my parents have lived here for all that time and because I grew up in this type of situation. So I've really seen a lot of things that have happened in this community. I've seen a lot of efforts to change the community. And I've been heartened by some, disappointed by others. But I've been here a while and I've seen these changes. On the positive side, Bethel has meant a sense of hope, a sense that people can work together to solve problems, a sense that we can empower ourselves. We can learn, we can take control over our fate and our destiny, and we can really work together to address some of the issues that we face.
A sense of hope indeed. That's what Bethel New Life has provided for the west side of Chicago. And that's a hopeful story that people all over the United States who know about communities and communities building themselves from the inside out know about. Everybody knows about Bethel. Almost everybody knows about the Dudley Street story. And we'll talk more about both of those stories because we've learned so much from them. But I think it's also important to note that there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller stories, not the big ones, not the $10 million ones, but the little block by block, church by church, household by household, business by business, public housing building by public housing building, where residents have said, you know, nobody is going to be rebuilding this neighborhood unless we do it. And so they've invested themselves fully in that task. And those are the stories we've tried to learn from. We've tried to gather those stories up and then open up a discussion with community folks, just like you all, across the United States, about then what are the major kinds of lessons that are to be learned from these stories. If you look at success, we ought to learn from it. We ought to be able to multiply these successes. That's what we've been trying to do. We've learned a lot. There are a lot of lessons in these stories. But I think probably if we had to think about the way in which one lesson continues to sort of float to the top of our consciousness, it would be a lesson about how communities at their center get built on the gifts of the people who live there. John, why don't you tell us about this major lesson that I think has become clear to us?
Right. Well, you know, if you'd had the good luck we had to go to city after city and look for where people are solving problems, where they're making the economy grow again, where they're gaining political power, where they're solving social problems, where they're creating new celebrations and recognition of culture, you would see, I think, what we saw, and that is that every single one of these initiatives had one common characteristic, and it's this. It's probably best exemplified by this picture here. It's a picture of a glass, and you know how, as a kid, people would ask you, is this glass half full or is it half empty? And the answer to that, we all know, is yes, it is. It's half full and it's half empty. And it is like us as individuals, right? We are people who have some deficiencies and emptiness, but we have some gifts and capacities. And it's also like neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are places that have capacities, and neighborhoods are places that have deficiencies, or some people would call them needs. But what you would see if you visited neighborhoods across this country is that the way communities get built, solve problems, and grow more powerful is by focusing on the capacities and not the needs. And yet we don't think about that very much because so many people speak to us in the language of needs. But if we think about it in our own lives, we will know that communities are built on capacities. Let me give you an example. I have a little hometown, small place in Wisconsin, 1,300 people, and there's a group there called the Knights of Columbus. And they decided to build a community center and a meeting hall for them, but they're going to give it to the town for a town hall and community center. And I was home, and I knew the 4 knights who were building it. And let me describe to you what I saw, because you've seen exactly the same thing. Up on the roof was a guy whose name is John, and he was putting in on the shingles, right, of this 2-story frame house. And John's a drunk. Everybody in town knows it. And incidentally, in the big city nearby, they think he's chemically dependent. But in our town, he's a drunk. We have room in our town for a drunk. The room is on the roof putting the shingles on our community center. And on the 2nd floor was a guy named Jim. And Jim was putting in an electric switch. But Jim left school at the end of the 8th grade. He said the teachers were too dumb to teach him. Now, I think people in university might say he's learning disabled. In my hometown, people just say he's slow. And he's our electrician. I could see him putting in the switch. And also on the 2nd floor, there's a guy named Steve, and Steve is a plumber. Right? And I also know that Steve has dark days. He becomes depressed. He stays home. Probably trouble at home with his wife and his children when that happens. And on the 1st floor was a guy named John who was putting in an oak flooring. like a carpenter, and he has one leg. And that's who built our community center. That's who built every place you have ever been or ever will be. Communities are built on the basis of the gifts and the capacities of people who also have deficiencies, but communities have never been built by a focus on their needs and deficiencies. Just think about any group you belong to. Think about a group at work, or think about in your community or in your religious organization. You could go around the members of that group and identify every one of them as being a person with a problem and deficiency, right? I can do that with my faculty. We have on my faculty, which I think is a very good faculty, a wonderful group, but we have a man who has cancer. We have a woman whose family has just fallen apart. We have a colleague, I think he's mad, but we're a good group. Because, like your groups, what we do is we have a quiet agreement that we're not going to focus on our cancer or our fallen apart families. But what we are is a group organized to lift up the gifts and the capacities of people who also have deficiencies. Now, I'll bet you that you've had that experience. Other people here, friends here in the studio, have you seen examples of the gifts of people who are also perhaps thought to have deficiencies as key actors? What about you?
I'm glad you asked that, because I'm a former welfare recipient and also a mother of two. And I used to live in southeastern Virginia, and I've had to deal with stereotypes and all of that that's associated with welfare dependency or dealing with welfare. But I've always had the incentive to work. So other welfare recipients and I put together a small business, a small janitorial business, and we were able to empower ourselves out of welfare dependency and into self-sufficiency.
So somebody defined you by your emptiness of money, and you redefined yourself. You found in yourself your capacity, right? Anybody else here have any? Yeah.
AmeriCorps gives out about 350 grants to communities around the country, and we have found that one of the most valuable resources in the community are the youth. That it's the youth that are mentoring and cleaning up the lots and doing conflict resolution, and that's one resource people don't usually tap into.
No. Well, I think you've seen what we've seen, and I know what everybody around the country who's listening has seen, is that communities are built by a focus and a mobilization of the gifts and the capacities of their local people. But we also saw something else, and that is that in every community there is another voice at work. And what you hear about communities is not what we're talking about here, about gifts and capacities. What you hear about is deficiencies, problems, and needs. Jode, why don't you tell us a little more about how that plays out?
Yeah, John, you've been really sort of concentrating, we've been thinking about for a moment here, that both the reality of us as individual human beings, that we all have some gifts and we all have some emptiness about us and some problems about it. What's true of each of us as persons, I think, is also true of whole communities, right? And what we've begun to discover, and I think I discovered it first from a person who has become a close friend and a real mentor to me, a 75-year-old woman who's a resident for her entire life of the South Bronx in New York City, and a woman who's done incredible work in that community. And I was sitting on her front stoop with Mrs. Johnson about 5 summers ago now, and asking her to tell me her stories, both success stories, and then I said, also, tell me what went wrong here. Tell me what, when you think about what happened in this community of the South Bronx, what do you think about? She thought for a moment, and then she said, Jody, I think that the worst thing that has happened to us here in the South Bronx is that we've been put into a prison. That was the word she used, and I hadn't heard it before. So I asked her to elaborate, tell me a little bit more about what she was thinking about. She said, I'm not talking here about a prison that's made up of high walls and barbed wire and machine guns, right? We know about that kind of prison. But she said, and here's the phrase I'll never forget. She said, the prison I'm talking about is a prison that's made up of other people's ideas about who we are here in the South Bronx. She said, which I now think is a brilliant formulation. She said then, I can't even go anyplace else in New York or in the suburbs and talk about my community, because the minute I say the word South Bronx, all of a sudden a whole flood of images comes into people's heads. All kinds of ideas. They think they know what I'm talking about when I say South Bronx, right? And she said what comes into their heads is all of a piece. It's all consistent. It's all about problems and needs and deficiencies. It's all about the emptiness, right? So John and I and some folks from communities began thinking about then, well, how would you begin to visualize this, right? And so this neighborhood needs map that we're now going to be showing is one way of thinking about what a community looks like when it's thought about only in terms of its emptiness, right? This is a needs map. This is a map that says, you know, the South Bronx is crime and child abuse and mental disabilities and welfare recipients and graffiti and slum housing and broken families and on and on and on, right? And what we heard was the strong voices of Mrs. Johnson and thousands like her that said, you know, this map is a prison. This has become a prison for us. And our problem with this map, it's like the glass, is not that this is an untrue map. This is a true map. All of these things exist not only in the South Bronx, but in the neighborhood I live in Chicago, and in all of the neighborhoods we work in. All of these problems exist, right? But the problem is that it's not the whole truth about those communities, and it's taken as if it is the whole truth. And whole sets of institutions and policies and powerful interests then pile on this needs map. Now, one of the things that's become so clear to us as we've gone from the community to community is that this needs map, which is so powerful, is not Mrs. Johnson's idea about who she is. It's not the idea of the folks in the block, in the churches, in the community building processes. They don't think about themselves as empty, deficient, needy, problematic. No, they have a different idea. But we know that this needs map is powerful, right? And so we began asking, well, if the folks in communities didn't draw this needs map about themselves, who did? Where does this needs map come from? It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Who drew it? So we began a little list of nominees for Cartographer of the Year, for people who draw needs maps. And John, I wonder whether you might nominate a few of our cartography people.
Yes. And it is strange because everybody knows communities are not built on needs. But there are, we think, at least 5 great institutions that have focused on neighborhoods as though that's all there, that is, but needs. And the first of those institutions is the one we're from, universities. Every university has people who are in the business of going into neighborhoods and looking at the deficiencies, counting them up. How many buildings that are below code? How many people are there who can't read? How many teenage pregnant girls are there? So universities have a big vested interest in counting up the deficiencies, and that's called needs surveys, right? Now, they do this work usually for some other institutions. The first of the other institutions that is interested in needs is a lot of foundations. A lot of foundations really give grants based on somebody coming in and telling them what's wrong with their neighborhood, what's bad about it, right? If you tell me what's bad, I'll give you some money. Now, not all foundations, but many, many are doing that. Another user of the university's needs surveys is the United Ways. They, in like manner, are often saying to communities, what we want to know is what's wrong. Now remember, nobody in the neighborhood needs to know that, right? They need to know what can we do about people's capacities. But somebody out there, in this case the United Way, wants to know what the people in the neighborhood don't need to know. So the United Way is another user of needs, but the United Way is changing. We know, Jody and I have had the wonderful opportunity to meet for 3 days with groups of United Way leaders, 120 of them across the country, and they're beginning to shift in terms of their emphasis. The third institution that we all know focusing on needs is governments. especially those that are in the health and human service area. Those programs are heavily focused on saying, what's wrong? What's missing? What are the needs, right? And the last institution, I think we hear about over and over again, the last institution is the downtown newspapers, the downtown television stations, and the national news media. I know that in Chicago, we recently took a Chicago newspaper and just went through one newspaper and began to read what it was saying about our neighborhoods and our city. And here are some of the headlines from one newspaper, one day. Violence scaring off voters. Domestic violence endless cycle. Grandmother says she told DCFS that slain boy had been beaten. Banks post record as robbers rally. Only 2 show interest in school board seats. 2 teens held in slaying of Star. Futile calls to 9/11 show police indifference. And that's the portrait that the media gives us of our community. Now, Ramona, what's happening in Washington?
Well, we know in Washington very much what you're saying here, I'm afraid. Looking at our media, listening to our universities, trying to seek funds, we almost have to refer to ourselves as disadvantaged, at risk. These very negative labels that I consider self-fulfilling prophecies. You would think that all of our boys are drive-by shooters, and all of our girls are crack moms who desert their babies as border babies in the hospitals. And it is a very, very glass empty picture that we get from the media here in Washington, I'm afraid.
So what we really saw in neighborhoods across the country was a struggle, an actual struggle over who are we. And the struggle is against the combined voices of 5 institutions: the great intellectual institution of the community, the university, the great philanthropies of the community, the United Way and the foundations, the government and its programs, and the communication system. When you have those powerful institutions broadcasting over and over and over again to people what's important about you, what's wrong, what's missing, finally some communities under the onslaught, they finally succumb. And they really begin to deteriorate because they believe that they are nothing but an empty place filled with empty people. Now, it is clear that communities are built on the basis of capacities and not deficiencies. And it is clear that there are great institutions saying deficiencies are what we want or need. And it would be all right if these deficiencies and these counts of needs were just used by these outside institutions and it didn't have any consequence in the neighborhoods. But in fact, what they do have devastating consequences in the neighborhoods. And Joe, I wonder if you could review what the effect of a constant bombardment of needs, deficiencies has upon neighborhood life.
Yeah. I want to do it briefly because it makes me angry to think about it. I think, John, that you touched on the first, and that is to say that although it's very clear that Mrs. Johnson and the thousands of people like her in communities across the United States didn't have the idea themselves that they were a collection of needs and problems and deficiencies, that sometimes some of Mrs. Johnson's neighbors begin to think, when the institutions are hammering on it time after time after time, that that's true. That's all we are. And once that happens, as all of you know who are interested in community building, we have a very high hill to climb in order to get back out into community building activity. I want to just tick off very quickly a couple of other, what I think are very devastating consequences, though, of the power of this needs map. And remember, we're never saying the problem with the needs map is that it's a false map. It's true, but it's not the whole truth. The power of the needs map does devastating things to community leadership. It is clear to us now that leadership which is designated as leadership because it attracts money to the communities, right? I mean, that's one of the ways you get designated a leader. That's what people respect. That the game we have set up for local leaders is, let's get up in the morning here in the neighborhood and do the best job we can of painting the needs map, of talking about the emptiness and the problem. In other words, let's do the best job we can at denigrating our neighbors, at making sure that when people think about our neighborhood, they think about deficiency and needs and problems, right? And then, if I'm a neighborhood leader, what am I supposed to do? I'm supposed to lead. Now, at least part of what leadership is finding and mobilizing people's resources and gifts, right? That's what leadership is. How do we bring people to the table to give their gifts, right? But I've just said there aren't any in my neighborhood. Look at what we don't have. Do you see why neighborhood leaders burn out, get schizophrenic? We ask them to do impossible things. I think it's absolutely an evil thing we do to neighborhood leaders, right? But not only does that needs map devastate leadership, it also, I think, determines who gets the money and how the money comes into the neighborhood. It comes in those little categories, categorical funding. Neighborhoods know that insofar as all these problems are real, they're all interrelated. They're all part of the same seamless web, right? But the money comes in for one little part of it. And the community wisdom that says, this is all about community, right, gets, in fact, left behind. At the same time, this map, the needs map, supports money going to folks who work for all the institutions that are there to fill up, after diagnosing, empty people, right? All of the helping institutions. We found, in fact, that something like a third of the dollars that go into city neighborhoods actually go, targeted to poor people, actually go to poor people. The other 2/3 go to helpers, to people whose job it is to fill up empty folks. Somewhere there's a problem there. We also know now that this map, this needs map, busts up local relationships. Because if I, like you, were experiencing welfare, for example, I would have to pay a lot of attention to my welfare worker because she's my lifeline, right? Every time I turn out there to my welfare worker, it's one less time I turn to my neighbor, to my church, to my block club to solve problems, you see? So by not using them, my relationships with my immediate block dry up, right? They just fall apart. So this needs map and its power busts up relationships. The other thing it does, obviously, is create a constant cycle of dependency. We got to go back next year and tell our funders that things just got worse despite all our best efforts, right? Because that's the only way we can get the money. That's the way the game's been set up. Last thing I want to say about the consequences of the needs map and its power is that I now think that the power of the needs map helps me to understand sometimes why so many people are so hopeless about our communities, right? If I'm your age, Sherman, and I'm in a neighborhood that I think is nothing but needs and problems, I don't see a future in that neighborhood. And my temptation is to go to the quick drug money or whatever the quick money is, because I don't want to invest in myself. I don't see a future in that neighborhood for me. You see what I'm saying? So I don't invest in myself, right? And I'm hopeless, right? But I also think that the hopelessness of our leadership in the State House, in city halls, and even in the White House and Congress can be explained by the power of that needs map. Because if that's really those needs, if that's what we think cities are, and city neighborhoods, and low-income communities, if that's what we think they really are, we know someplace that pouring money into those neighborhoods on the basis of the needs map is like pouring it down an ever-deepening well, right? And we know that the game we've set up means that they will have to come back next year and ask for more money because we've set up the game to reward failure. Right? Those are just a few of the kinds of consequences that I think now the power of this needs map have. If even some of those are true, the good news is that in community after community where we collected these hundreds of success stories, everybody was engaged in the act of throwing out the needs map, discarding it, and saying with Mrs. Johnson, that's somebody else's idea about who we are. We need a different kind of map. Let's draw one. And so they've done that. And most of the rest of our discussion tonight and in our next sessions will be about the other map that they've drawn. John, do you want to just introduce us briefly to that?
The other map, of course, is the map that identifies the full half. And here's a way of thinking about that map. It's a map that has 3 basic building blocks. They are the 3 building blocks we found in every neighborhood that was growing power. They are the gifts of individuals, the power and the work of the associations of citizens, and the assistance and support of local institutions. And it is those 3 building blocks that are really central to the possibilities of community building. Now, on the west side of Chicago, there's a wonderful organization that has understood this and built a new kind of organizing process based upon the gifts and the capacities, on the assets of a neighborhood. The leader of the organization is Jackie Reed, and let's hear her tell about how that goes.
The Westside Health Authority is a coalition of 29 community organizations. Most of the organizations are grassroots neighborhood groups that consist of, who have many members who are block club members. It's called the Westside Health Authority because we believe that the people who live in the neighborhoods really are the authority on our community. For so many years, we have not been given credit for what we know out here. You've had experts to come in the neighborhoods with their solutions that have been born out of universities researching and what have you. But these solutions have not worked. We've seen so many problems just continue to get worse. So basically, we were looking for ways in which our own community people, citizens in the neighborhood, could begin to come up with their own ideas and see their own ideas manifested and work and put into public policies to make a difference in our neighborhoods. So we are the authority. We are not a social service agency. I am a social worker by profession. And after working 20 years in social service agencies, I really wanted to use my ability to help plan and direct a way for community people to give their gifts and not depend upon professionals. Now, this is not to say that professionals don't contribute and make a contribution to our community, but I think over the past 20 years we have seen an upsurge in dependency on professionals, and that has meant that many people in our own neighborhoods have lost their own confidence in their abilities to do things for each other, to do things for their neighbors. When you basically turn a neighborhood into something where clients live and a place where services are provided, then people don't want themselves to be associated with that neighborhood. So this is not a place where services are provided to people. This is a place where opportunities are provided for people to serve each other, to give to their neighbors, to help rebuild the community. And I think that the only way community will be rebuilt is that we can find the gifts and capacities of everybody in our neighborhood and give them an opportunity to give their gifts back to our community.
So Jackie Reed is telling us about what a community that is renewing itself has as its center, and it is not clients. It is not people being served. It is citizens and their capacities, their associations, and serving institutions. And it is each of those 3 basic assets that we'll be focusing on in this session and the next 2 sessions, so that we can really become very clear by reminding ourselves of the central community building assets. So for the rest of this evening, we're going to be focusing on the gifts of individuals.